Since being declared extinct over 40 years ago, the thylacine has generated more controversy and obsession than any other extinct animal, with reportedly hundreds of sightings since its extinction date. Being equally obsessed and convinced it's still out there, I spent the last 8 years covering over 1,000 ground miles in search of it. And I was truly starting to believe it was gone, until a recent bit of information that no one else on the planet has that is undeniably the closest thing to a living thylacine that anybody has ever seen. This video will detail everything I've found so far that convinces me that the thylacine still exists. In 2016, for the pilot episode of Extinct or Alive, we started our search in Tasmania. Tasmania, the last known location of the thylacine to ever exist. That's right, I finally had the funds and the means to go on this expedition that I thought could change the world. When we first went down this road of looking for extinct creatures, it was sort of a tinfoil hat thing, right? I would tell other scientists and people in the academic community, I believe that some of these animals that have been declared extinct could still be out there. And it was like I was Percy Fitzpatrick in the Lost City of Z, standing up there talking about finding El Dorado, and everybody going, "You're crazy, you're a lunatic." But there was just so much information, and there was just so many eyewitness reports, especially when it came to the thylacine. And just like any novice young explorer whose dreams are bigger than the reality, you thought you're going to start with the big one. You're going to find this, uncover it all, and change the world of natural history as we know it. And while there were dozens of very capable trackers and people who had gone out looking for it, just like everybody, you feel like if you can just have your shot, if you can just take your crack at it, maybe you'll be the one to get lucky. And that was what made me have this burning desire to get to Tasmania and actually find the thing. Let me tell you a little bit about what the thylacine is. The thylacine was the apex predator of Tasmania until the early 1800s when European settlers arrived. They quickly labeled the thylacine as a livestock killer and a nuisance to farmers, despite evidence that feral dogs and mismanagement were actually responsible for this. This labeling the thylacine as a livestock killer and a pest ultimately resulted in the Tasmanian government introducing £1 bounties for the heads of adult thylacine and 10 shillings per joey, which is a baby marsupial. Estimates from the time suggest that approximately 3,500 thylacine were killed by humans from 1830 to 1920. But given the numerous sightings and that Tasmania is widely regarded as the last stronghold for the thylacine, and with many parts of the state inaccessible to humans, the animal could still be hiding out there somewhere, or at least that's what I thought. And just by happenstance, by coincidence, and a bit of luck as I saw it, major wildfires broke out in Tasmania. Wildfires that actually threatened to shut down the expedition altogether. But while I was getting phone calls from insurance people and the network going, "You can't go, you're going to burn to a crisp," I started to look at a map. And as I looked at a map, I realized that these fires were encroaching down a series of mountainous terrain that, if we planned appropriately, would actually allow the fires to come up over the mountainous ridges and through the valley to create a funnel effect, therefore pushing all the wildlife into a very narrow corridor, which of course means it takes a giant piece of habitat and funnels all of the animals, thylacine and their prey included, into one distinct area that I can target my search efforts. To me, this was genius. I was like, this is the perfect opportunity to see if there's a thylacine. This large, transient marsupial carnivore will have no choice but to go down this valley. And if we're smart, we stay out of the fire's way, but get in the fire's path, and we place our cameras, our traps, our scent trails, and everything else in the heart of this valley, then any thylacine, along with all of the other animals that decide to walk through this valley, is surely going to be ours. So I partnered with Nick Mooney, a very respected biologist and at one time Tasmania Parks and Wildlife Service officer. Now, Nick has a very interesting story. When it comes to people that have sightings of Bigfoots and Loch Ness monsters, you get the big bearded Bubba backwoods guys and the guys that clearly drink too many, Budweisers on the weekend or maybe have dabbled in the odd drugs. Nick is not that guy. In fact, he's the polar opposite. So his story comes to us from a place of not wanting to be labeled one of these toothless tinfoil hat guys. He was out on a survey looking for wildlife, completely believing that the thylacine had been eradicated from the planet. And as he tells the story, and I don't want to put words in his mouth, he was utterly shocked as he came out of his tent and looked and saw not one, but 2 thylacine clear as day. Now again, Nick is a biologist. He knows every single species of animal that lives in Tasmania. He's not somebody who's got a case of mistaken identity, who's got a case of shadow lurking, which is where you see something in the shadows and turn it into something in your mind. This is a scientist who did not even want to tell this story for fear of being labeled a whack job. So when Nick actually had this sighting, he held on to this information, going through a mental struggle with himself as to whether or not to announce it to the world for I think over a year, if I remember correctly, before finally one day he put his foot down and said, listen, I've seen thylacine. They are still out here, no BS. And when somebody as well respected as Nick Mooney says this, who is an actual biologist, you have to take that very seriously. So of course, in partnering with Nick Mooney, we went back to that general area, went to tell his story, and put in that survey in addition to the fire. So we checked all of the boxes, and it just seemed like everything was gonna line up to find a thylacine. So here we are camped in this beautiful valley in Tasmania, and I was absolutely blown away by the abundance of animals. I mean, it was crazy. I'd take my thermal binoculars at night and stand up on a small hill and look out over the valley, and it looked like the plains of Africa. But instead of having wildebeest and zebra everywhere, it was filled with marsupials, wombats, wallabies, quolls, all kinds of incredible creatures. And we did everything we could. I dragged dead wallabies to create scent traps, and I put out camera traps, and I made blinds to hide in, and I tried playing sounds to bring in a thylacine. And we were able to see the quoll, which at the time was believed to be the thylacine's closest living relative, even though now we know it's the Dunnart. And we were able to get the Tasmanian devil on camera, which, what an unbelievably cool creature that is. But sadly, even in the face of the fire, in the face of all these animals trotting by us down this funneling, in the face of having Nick Mooney stand right beside me and work on this expedition, we found no concrete evidence of a thylacine. We did at the end find what looked like it could have been an old den. There was some bones in there. It really looked like a predator had dragged a carcass into that, but it was old, there was nothing definitive, there was no DNA to work off of, and while it was an incredibly cool expedition, this somewhat put the nail in the coffin for me as far as believing that the thylacine could still be in Tasmania. But still having this gut feeling, which I know is not scientific, but it's something that served me well my whole life, that the thylacine was still out there, I needed to mount the next expedition. Fortunately, the James Cook University, a very well accredited institution, was also conducting a survey for the thylacine. So I pooled my resources, I packed up the team, and we headed to Cape York, the northernmost point of the Australian mainland, where many eyewitnesses came forward stating they found evidence of something resembling the thylacine. So in teaming up with the James Cook University, they were doing a study monitoring the abundance of prey animals in the region with the ancillary aim of searching for a thylacine. Now it may seem ridiculous, but this sort of told me that there was more information than you might think is out there or that is publicly available, because if a major accredited academic institution is putting in resources like 2,000 trail cameras, if I remember correctly, to look for the thylacine, you better believe that there's some sort of information that has led them to think that there's at least a remote possibility that this animal could be there. And with more than 40% of Australia remaining unexplored, there's bound to be some places where the thylacine could still roam undetected, or at least that's what I thought. That place for me was Cape York. So when we hit the ground in Cairns, Australia, and met up with the researchers at the university, we started to dig into what could this piece of information be. Well, allegedly, this broad survey was sparked by a sighting by a credible tour guide in the peninsula. Not just any tour guide, but again, just like with Nick Mooney, somebody who had been doing this for years, who was trusted and had a reputation, and again, didn't really want to share the information, which makes you feel far more like it's credible than when somebody's spouting nonsense on the internet. So we talked with this tour guide, and he told me that he had seen a thylacine. No, wait a minute. He didn't actually tell me he'd seen a thylacine. Not one anyway. Not even two. he said he saw 4 animals.
1, 2, 3, 4 sets of red eyes.
Bright red.
Bright red.
And apparently, they even played with his tracking dog. So he would head up into this Cape York area, the super remote area, 500 miles from Cairns, and up there with his tracking dog, he'd go out, and this one time, at the crack of dawn, if I remember correctly, he had 4 thylacine running around playing with his dog. So this was like, holy crap, like this has to be it, right? This is a guy who knows what he's talking about. And as he told me, this was not at dusk, this was not way off in the distance. This was 50 yards from him watching these animals all play together as he fumbled to try and get a camera out of his tent. And so he was convinced thylacine were in the remote parts of the Cape York Peninsula. So with this information in hand, we traveled to the area 500 miles from Cairns and the James Cook University to where the tour guide said he had seen these 4 animals. Now, when you get to an area like this, the first thing you have to do is converse with the local people in the community to see if by chance they had had any more recent sightings. So we went to an Aboriginal community, and there, in sitting down with the elders, they told us about the legend of an animal they called the moon tiger. Now, when they explained what the moon tiger was, they made it very, very clear that it was a large dog with stripes on its back, it wasn't a dingo, it was all the things that checked the boxes of a thylacine. However, in that community, it had been quite a while since anybody had actually seen one. Regardless, we were in the right area, and so we decided to put our cameras out. We put cameras everywhere, all over the region. What we discovered was actually kind of sadly shocking. While we found some very cool native wildlife like big pythons and things like that, we saw a ton of large mice that have been introduced, wild pigs, which of course are invasive and a problem, and the big killer, dingoes. And when I say the big killer, what I mean by that is historically, we know that where there are dingoes, there would not be thylacine. And the reason being, dingoes were actually brought to mainland Australia by colonizing people, by Aboriginal people some 4,000 years ago. And the dingoes were capable of out-competing the thylacine. Because dingoes evolved from more traditional mammals and not marsupials, they were actually better predators and better suited to be carnivores in mainland Australia. And thus, they outcompete the thylacine for space, for resources, for habitat, for den sites, and everything else, and likely they'd actually kill the thylacine. So this is the reason that 4,000 years ago, the thylacine went extinct from mainland Australia, because people brought in the dingo. A lot of people think dingoes are native to Australia. They're not. They were actually brought there 4,000 years ago by people as sort of like village dogs. Anyway, Australia was inconclusive to say the least. Finding those dingoes in such a remote area made us feel like the chances of finding a thylacine were next to zero. So now that I've struck out in both Tasmania and Australia, and the fact that I still sincerely believe that the thylacine is extant, even if it's in tiny remote populations, I have to conduct the most difficult survey of my life in the most remote, wild, rugged, and dangerous place in the world, Papua New Guinea. But I didn't have the intel. Papua New Guinea is a crazy remote place. There's not a lot of communications coming in and out of there. There's a lot of very small tribal villages that are not in communication with the outside world. And so I needed to start gathering this information. At the same time, I also needed the resources. So we were leaning into Animal Planet and Extinct or Alive franchise and hoping that they were going to fund the next expedition. And no matter what, I still have and had this gut feeling that the thylacine could still be out there. I will admit that at the time, it had really started to hurt my hope, right? When you go to Tasmania and you put in 200-300 miles on foot, and then you go to Australia and you put in another 1,000 miles or so by vehicle and on foot, and you find nothing, it really does start to give you a kick in the nuts as to whether or not you believe something could be out there. But the gut feeling, that little nagging instinct that I still have that the animal could still be there, even if functionally extinct, kept fueling me. Well, sadly, as I'm sure many of you know, Extinct or Alive got canned. Yep, COVID hit, and while we had a whole season 3 planned, all travel got shut down, budgets got reworked, the world went into chaos. Basically, all the executives that I'd worked with at Animal Planet got fired, and of course, all of the money at Animal Planet dried up because the network sort of doesn't exist any longer. And so we were really not in a spot to conduct a survey to go to Papua New Guinea. But I didn't care, and I still don't care, because I was going to pool the resources myself, pay out of my own pocket with the little bit of money I had if it meant that I could find the thylacine and change the course of natural history as we know it. But I still needed this information. So at that point in time, I thought the thylacine was in Papua New Guinea, not Western Papua, and I'll explain what happened. While digging into this and talking with people at the University of New Guinea, I believe it's called, the university in Port Moresby, I was starting to collect reports. There were historical reports, we were looking into range maps, and we were starting to gather intel. Now, at this point in time, I wasn't getting very far, but I did, and this was my first real clue, I did meet a guy who was heading to Western Papua, not Papua New Guinea, to go climb this big mountain. And I won't name the mountain because I don't want to give away the area on this one. But he was going to climb this big mountain in Western Papua, and it was a big, massively expensive, difficult expedition, especially during the height of COVID, to get there and climb this mountain. And him and his two friends were going, and they invited me to go. I, of course, couldn't go at the time. It was the height of COVID. And so I said, just do me a favor. Conduct a test for me to see if anybody has ever seen a thylacine. And he's like, well, how do I conduct a test? I just asked them, right? So I devised this thing that I think is pretty clever. Here's what I did. I printed out 10 different photos, 5 of which were native to Papua New Guinea and known. There was a tree kangaroo, there was a wallaby, there was a saltwater crocodile, I can't even remember what else, but I printed out photos of known native animals to the area. Then I printed out 4 species of animal that are not known to Papua New Guinea, but could be confused for animals in other parts of the world, such as an American crocodile, a large gray kangaroo from mainland Australia, and a few other creatures like that. And then the 10th photograph was that of a thylacine. Now these were all black and white, they all matched in style, and they all looked similar. And I said to my buddy that was going to climb the mountain, I said, take these 10 photos, and when you're there with the guides, when you're sitting around at night, just put all the photos out and ask them which animals they've seen on their expeditions climbing the mountain and in this incredibly remote part of Western Papua, and which animals haven't they. And get this is where it gets really interesting. Because this was a blind study where there was no incentive for anybody to lie or tell anything, 6 photos the guys said they'd seen. They'd seen saltwater crocodiles, they'd seen tree kangaroos, they'd seen wallabies, whatever the other animals were, I don't even remember. And more than half the guides, I think there were 6 guides, 4 of which all said, I've seen this one, the thylacine. None of them, not one of them, pointed to the wrong animals and said, I've seen this. So these guys knew their shit. They knew their animals in the region and said, no, we don't have these 4, but we do have these 6. And then he was digging deeper, as I asked my buddy to do. And they said, yeah, we see these all the time, referring to crocodiles, and yeah, we see these, pretty regularly, the tree kangaroos, but these guys right here, the striped dogs, as they called them, we only see them very, very occasionally, right? And, and one of them, I forgot to mention this part of the story, this is important, was dingoes, and none of them had ever seen dingoes. So this was a really good sign, right? Because dingoes weren't there to outcompete the thylacine. So none of them had seen dingoes, but 4 of the 6 had said that they had at some point over the years seen a thylacine. So now my head's spinning. Now I've started to target in on an area, specifically at the base of this mountain, that would be impenetrable to dingoes, too difficult for dingoes to colonize this area, that could potentially have these striped dogs, these thylacines. So I've got this information, it's 2020, 2021, all these other little reports are starting to trickle in, a villager here, a climbing guide here, somebody's seen an adult, somebody's seen a cub, a thylacine attacking livestock in Iranjaya, all these various little pieces of information, but they're still so scattered and over such a large area. So I was like, how do I narrow this in? So this is where this piece of information comes in, guys, and this is really something that's it's pretty next level, and I'm choosing how I share this information, because if it gets out in the wrong way, it could be dire to the thylacine. So let me explain. I got in touch with a woman named Rose, who was working at the University of Port Moresby on the relatively recently rediscovered Papuan singing dogs. Now, singing dogs are a highland dog that we thought basically didn't exist or were lost to science, and some 5 or 6 years ago, they were rediscovered. And this was a big deal. We're talking about packs of highly vocal, large carnivorous dogs. And so if you think that it was hard to find them in Papua. Imagine how hard it would be to find a small, quiet marsupial canine that doesn't make a lot of sound, that's very reclusive, like the thylacine. So I get in touch with Rose. I'm talking about singing dogs. It's really interesting. I'm getting all this information on where she found them and what's going on. I basically asked her to conduct the same test, the same surveys that I did with my buddy who was the climber. And I said, take these photos, try it this way, blah, blah, blah. And Rose was like, I got it. I know what to do. She comes from a scientific background. She totally understood. And so Rose would head out into these villages looking for purebred singing dogs to help work on their genetics and learn about them. And she'd show all these photos, and she was finding singing dogs sort of all over the place, which was great because the singing dogs were oftentimes actually hybridizing with the local village dogs that they were using for hunting. Now, Rose would venture into these villages, she'd start talking to people, and it was really tough because there's no cell phone service anywhere there. So Rose would head out for like 3 weeks, 4 weeks, a month, and I wouldn't hear from her for that whole time. Then she'd come back and be like, nope, nothing, nope, nothing. Then, one day, I get an email out of the blue from Rose where she tells me there's a man in a village who owns a striped dog. Well, I'm freaking out, right? I'm on the edge of my seat. These striped dogs are a thing that villagers and villages have talked about as though they're around regularly. It's nothing unusual. And the prospect of a thylacine sighting was just unbelievably tantalizing. So I asked Rose, what can we do? Can I pay for you to go there, try and vet this, go and see the striped dog, take your phone, get a photo, all of that? And she says, no problem, no problem. Again, this was during the height of COVID. So it was incredibly difficult to facilitate, to even get anywhere, to get a plane. There were no planes in there, blah, blah, blah. But basically, I managed to help support Rose to get to this village. And I was on the edge of my seat for a month because she disappeared from the face of the earth because there's no cell phone service anywhere. And she gets there. This guy's telling Rose he found 2 pups of striped dogs in a hollowed out log, which is the preferred den site, by the way, of the thylacine. He took the 2 pups back to the village. One of them died almost immediately, and the second one he raised in his home. He said it was striped, it had a different back legs, it ran differently, it literally checked all of the characteristics of a thylacine. But, sadly, by the time Rose got there, one of the other village dogs had killed it. Now keep in mind, this is not like living in West Hollywood where we pamper our little pooches. These are remote villages where dogs are used as tools, hunting tools. And if a dog can't cut it, sadly, it gets killed by other dogs. Also, this is where the story gets so disheartening. Also, after the striped dog had been killed by another village dog, they decided to eat it. So they ate the striped dog, which potentially was a thylacine. They cooked it up and discarded the bones. Well, I said to Rose, please tell me you found some of the bones. Well, sure enough, she found the bones. They were charred, they were super gnarly looking, they were all practically destroyed and not distinguishable of anything at all, except for one photo. That's right, I'm getting goosebumps thinking about it. Rose sent me a photo of a charred, broken, gnarly looking lower jaw that perfectly matches the look of a thylacine jaw. Now, sadly, Rose didn't keep the jaw. She left it there. I just have this one photo. There's no way to tell for sure that it was a thylacine, but the fact that in 2021, I believe it was at this point, Rose got a photograph of what clearly looks like a thylacine jaw and a first-hand report, not a second or third-hand report, but a first-hand report from a man who says he found a thylacine and raised it to semi-adulthood before it was killed. It just lights this fire in my belly and under my bones that I cannot explain. Now, sadly, in order to do this expedition right, I have to raise close to $5 million. We need helicopters. We have to go to this incredibly remote area. By the way, this area that Rose went to is the same area that my buddy went and climbed the mountain. So it's in this very unique valley that dingoes cannot get to because it's so impenetrable by the geography of it. So you need major funds to get in there. I want to put out something like 2,000 camera traps and survey them for 3 months. So I won't say where this is for obvious reasons of trying to protect the animal and the fact that if it's still alive, it will still be alive in a year or two when I'm able to finally pool all the resources together. But this is my shining hope. This is my jewel in the sky of the thylacine could still be out there, could still be extant, even if it's in a tiny remote population. So I will, in my lifetime, mount an expedition to this very remote area in Western Papua to look for the thylacine, but I'm not doing it half-assed. I'm not doing it with 10 trail cameras and a camera guy. I'm going with a big crew with thousands of cameras, and I'm spending 3 or 4 months there until we can definitively answer whether or not the thylacine is still out there in this valley, or if I've just been sent on a crazy wild goose chase. What do you guys think? Do you think the thylacine could still be alive? Where do you think it could still be? Let me know, like and subscribe, hit that button, you know, all that corny crap, but just do it and tell me what you think, because I'd love to know if you think it's worth me getting out there and looking for the thylacine. You know, if you loved this video, we actually did a whole nother video on thylacine and how they are going to be brought back through de-extinction science and genetic work. If you want to learn about that, watch this video right here.